Thank you. Well, our focus during this Spotlight interview is on leadership. In times of crisis, leaders must act and communicate with integrity and compassion and be accountable. All core values that the IoD seeks to develop in its membership and indeed as an organisation itself. Who better than to provide an international perspective on leadership, integrity, and compassion than David Miliband. David is an influential voice globally, not only as President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, but also for his distinguished political career. He was the youngest British Foreign Secretary in 3 decades, but also served as Environment Secretary and led on groundbreaking policies fighting climate change at that time, indeed pioneering the world's first legally binding climate change policies, legally binding emissions reductions requirements, something we're all starting to hear a little bit more about as the months and years progress, I'm sure. He was the recipient of the 2019 Stockholm Human Rights Award, along with the IRC, in recognition of the work done to help and support so many people uprooted by conflict and natural disasters across more than 30 countries worldwide. And in 2016, he was named Fortune magazine's one of the world's greatest leaders in 2016, certainly a title many joining this conference would covet. It's great to have you with us, David. I can even give the quotes attributed by the US President Bill Clinton, calling you one of the most ablest, most creative public servants of all time. But certainly with such a distinguished background, you're certainly someone that we're delighted to be hearing from in these times of considerable crisis. You're joining us from New York. I'm in Doha because the pandemic has grounded so many of us. But we're also speaking shortly after the release of that IPCC report on climate change, a report which has given so many of us pause for thought. Given the dual crises that we're still living through right now, how important would you say the leadership that we're seeing globally is, and how would you rate it?
Well, thanks very much, Hala. It's very good to be with you. Yes, you can hear the police sirens in the background. That tells you that I'm in New York, but good to be able to have this conversation. Look, I think you're right to highlight COVID and climate together, because they're both crises of an interconnected world whose connections are not being well managed. So leadership in that sense has been found really quite drastically wanting. There's the acute crisis, both of COVID itself and of the extreme weather events that are associated with global warming. And there's the chronic problem of an increasing vacuum, I think, in global political and economic leadership. And that's doubly dangerous when the threats are so real. So I think that anyone looking at the geopolitical scene at the moment, the global political scene, would say that the need for coordinated, engaged political leadership is greater than ever, but that it is more lacking certainly than any time since the end of the Cold War in 1990. And in some ways, the global situation feels more volatile even than during the Cold War itself between 1945 and 1990. There's a quite good metaphor, I think, that's used by Madeleine Albright, the former US Secretary of State. She said that during the Cold War, the international situation was like two tankers in the Suez Canal pointing in opposite directions in a kind of direct opposition. After 1990, in the post-Cold War period, it was like marshalling a ship in the English Channel. You could see land on a good day, 26 miles between England and France. Then she said, but in the 2010s, it's like navigating in the high seas without a good compass. And that feels like the global challenge today. And it's one that we need to come to terms with, whether you're in the government sector, the private sector, or I would add in the NGO sector as well. And that's where I'm speaking from a global non-governmental organization.
So how would you start to turn this around? Where does this come from? Because certainly when the pandemic became the reality for most of us, we were all listening very carefully to the World Health Organization, and the measures that they were putting forward were things that have been used for centuries. The basics were always there. It was the basics we had to follow in terms of cleanliness and distance. And again, and working together, arguably. And when it comes to certainly leaders coming together to tackle this, these are the basics. We get into this pandemic together. We can only come out of it if we work together. It's no secret that with the climate crisis that's raging, it's coordinated global action that will be needed. The basics, you could argue. And yet it's like herding cats. Why do people struggle so much with this? Why are we seeing such a crisis in leadership globally?
Well, I think there's a pretty simple answer to that, actually, which is that it's easier to put off tackling difficult problems than it is to tackle them. And I'm afraid that's even the case in the midst of a crisis. But I don't want to just give a glib answer to what you'd said, because I think you're raising some really important points. I mean, the first thing is we have to take seriously the motto that prevention is better than cure. The truth about COVID is that the world has been underinvesting in pandemic preparedness and response for years. Remember, you said that the basics are pretty easy. 3 billion people around the world don't have access to clean drinking water in their own homes. And that's a pretty good definition of the basics. So we're not doing well as a world at the basics. And we're not doing well enough at all at prevention. Second, and really important point, I think lying behind some of what you said, leadership isn't just for quote unquote leaders. Leadership when it comes to pandemics means citizens and scientists and doctors in hospitals or health clinics all around the world having a sense of responsibility about their reporting systems, and for those systems to be open and fluid, because leadership in the modern world can't just be restricted to the few. I mean, I run a large global humanitarian organization. When we thought about our new strategic plan, which is all about outcomes and evidence, it's hard-headed humanitarianism in that sense, we put our clients at the center, because the truth is, however much aid you have, the biggest contributors to helping people survive and recover in the face of emergency is what they do themselves. And so I think that leadership has to be seen at many levels, not just a few. The coordination in that sense has to be vertical as well as horizontal. And then there's a third point, to avoid making this just a long lecture, but a third point which I think is important. The global politics don't help, let's be honest about this. We're living at a time of contestation, not just between China and the US, but there's a sense of global contest between East and West, between North and South, between democracies and autocracies. And it's certainly obviously the case that the presumptions about leadership of 1945, those presumptions in a way embodied in the permanent members of the UN Security Council, China, the US, Russia, UK and France, you can't say today that those are the 5 preeminent countries that would be fashioned on a UN Security Council that was built from scratch today. So there's a global fragmentation of politics. And I think that's an important part of the understanding why the WHO is underfunded and underpowered, and why too many of the efforts around climate change and the failings around that have a global dimension as well as a national dimension.
Okay, well, let's turn to climate change now, because this is a slow burn issue, as you'd mentioned, but it's certainly one that people have been aware of since the COP summit started. We're now looking forward to COP26 being held in Glasgow in the UK, a real opportunity for the UK to show leadership and to show an example to the world. Given the preparations that are going ahead for this and the situation that we find ourselves in right now, do you think we're in a good place when it comes to seizing the mantle and tackling climate change on what the scientists really had said was the last chance saloon?
Well, we're not in a good place, no. I mean, it's obvious from the International Panel on Climate Change report that's just come out and which you reference. We're off track to meet the commitments of the Paris conference 6 years ago, which set the global goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. And while it's not the case that every extreme weather event is caused by climate change, enough of them are, and enough of them are influenced by it, for us to realize a really important founding fact that has not been well argued or well explained. Global warming of up to 1.5 degrees is not just about an average rise in temperature. It's also about the knock-on effects to more extreme weather events. And when the President Trumps of this world say, look, what have we got to worry about? Who's worried about being 1 degree more warmer or 2 degrees warmer? What that neglects is the potentially cataclysmic effects that it has on sea levels and on other extreme weather events. So I think there's a really founding point here that this is about chronic as well as acute change. Second thing is, we have to recognize that there is more consensus about global science than ever before. And the fact that the US, China, and the EU, the three biggest emitters, are not arguing about the science, at least at the administration level. The US and there's still a divide between the parties in the US over climate, but the administrations in those three entities are now very committed to action. That's a very significant and I think positive step forward. But the immediate point that arises is that environment is not, or climate is not just an issue for climate change ministers. It's a social justice issue, it's an economic issue. Decarbonisation, which is what we need to do, involves costs and benefits. I believe, when I was Environment Secretary, we published the Stern Review in 2006, which was the first time there'd been a calculation to show that the costs of inaction are greater than the costs of action. But there are distributional consequences. And that's one of the reasons that it's been so hard to fashion change, that countries are arguing about who has to do what on the principles of social justice, as well as and ability to pay, as well as on the question of the amount of contribution they make to the global climate crisis. So I think this is a Rubik's cube. And my own view is it's not going to be answered unless three factors are brought to play. One is government leadership, because in the end, only governments can be the regulators. That's at an international level as well as a national level. Secondly, business, and I think this is widely recognized, has an incredibly important role to play. Business is the innovators, but they're also the capital mobilizers. But the third element is mass mobilization of civil society. And that is something that I think is really important. It's not just about the quote unquote green movement. It's about all of us being aligned behind a set of goals that are in our own interests and certainly in our children's interests.
And is that something you think we're starting to see, certainly with investors? They're now trying to change investment principles for certain companies to make sure that they're investing in projects that are sustainable and more green. Certainly a lot of consumers now, everyday consumers, are choosing the more sustainable options. Do you see some kind of hope on the horizon when it comes to people power moving the agenda somewhat?
Well, I'm a very hopeful person, but I think that we've got to be realistic. Happy talk costs us all dear. If we just tell ourselves that it's all going to be fine, it won't be fine. And we've got to realize that when the UN Secretary General says that the new IPCC report is code red, I mean, what you do when you're in code red is you go onto war footing. And we're not yet on war footing when it comes to mobilizing all the resources of society to preserve our own future. I mean, I always used to say as Environment Secretary, we're living as if there were 3 planets, not 1. And we've got to live as if there's 1 planet. And we've got to make it easy for people to make changes, but we've also got to make the bias towards change rather than the bias against it. And I think there's a long way to go on that score. The movement of capital that you refer to is good, but it's interesting, the language, isn't it? Talking about going green. What we, I think, need to be really precise about is that while net zero is right, we've got to be careful with the suggestion. I don't think you were making this, but there's a danger, maybe suggestion is the wrong word, with the implication that somehow we can keep polluting, but if we just have enough carbon sinks, everything will be okay. That's why I use the phrase decarbonization earlier in our conversation. We've got to stop producing the carbon, not just compensate for it, if we're to live as if there is 1 planet rather than 3. And so we've got to have the right definition of net zero not one that allows for greenwashing. And so I think there's real need around what may seem like some quite nerdy issues to do with data, to do with legitimacy, to do with the integrity of different claims that are being made. And having that on a global basis is absolutely essential. But so are what you referred to as the basics in respect of COVID. The basics in respect of climate are that we can't carry on relying on energy systems that, for example, are coal-based. And so China has made significant commitments in respect of climate, but it's still producing coal-fired power stations. The US has got significant commitments. It's still got a significant coal industry. We've got to tackle this at the supply side as well as the demand side if we're to take it seriously.
So we seem to be taking some of the right steps, a gradual approach, perhaps, to make some kind of change, but perhaps not enough if we're to reach the 1.5 degree warming limit that certainly we had been aiming for and is starting to look increasingly out of our grasp at this stage. Given the events that we've been seeing, the mass flooding across parts of Central Europe that have killed hundreds of people, the ongoing wildfires in places like Canada and Siberia, where wildfires really ought not to be happening. Given the events that we're all living through and seeing on a more regular basis, if this isn't the turning point needed to provoke that change in consciousness about tackling this climate crisis, what do you think it would take for us all to start adjusting our course in a much more radical fashion?
Well, that's a very good point. What more warning do we need? But if you listen to the debate in the US, I live in New York, if you listen to the debate here, you'd think, well, what on earth will it take for people to get their heads out of the sand? Because the truth is that we're seeing the consequence now of the failure of decision making over the last 30 or 40 years. And what the amount of global warming that's baked into the emissions that have already happened show that the compensation for previous pollution is not going to be enough to save us from a very, very difficult set of decades ahead, even if you were to limit carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions at the current level. And I don't think that catastrophism works, but we're going to be works as a persuasion tool, but we're going to be faced with more catastrophes. And that, I think, is the reality of the next decade, whatever happens. And so the warnings are going to be increasingly evident. I mean, the pictures that you see from Greece or Germany or China, the flooding there, North America, you're right to mention it. And I think there's going to be a real requirement for speaking truth to power. Those leaders at any level who want to say this is our grandchildren's problem, those leaders who want to say it's someone else's problem, they need to be called out. And that's the importance of the reporting mechanisms. It's the importance of taking on the happy talk. And it's the importance of also really holding our own feet to the fires that are burning. You said earlier we're perhaps not on track. We're definitely not on track. I mean, it's not catastrophism to tell you that, it's just facts. And we've got a hell of a job on our hands to avoid the 1.5 degrees average rise. And we've got an enormous job to make the case that the costs of inaction are greater than the cost of action. And this is where I think the business side of this is really important. I can't remember, it may even have been when Mrs. Thatcher, who I didn't agree with much about politics, but in 1989, I think, she made a speech. It may even have been to the Institute of Directors. I can't remember. I'm old enough that I should remember. But she made a speech about global warming then and about its dangers. And to be fair, she was actually I don't know, but to be fair, but as a matter of fact, she was a scientist at university, and if you go back to that speech, she explains it extremely well. But one of the things that she neglected, I think, ironically, given where she was coming from politically, say was not really is not my starting point politically, she neglected the role of innovation and of business, I think. And this is where I think the business community has an ability to be far-sighted, not short-sighted. I mean, I know there's a whole separate debate about short-termism, but any business that's relying on a high carbon strategy is going to get found out. and it's going to have stranded assets and all the rest of it. And I really think that in those three elements that I said were key to success: government leadership, business innovation, mass mobilization, they don't have to come in that order. And when governments are in retreat from big problems, and I see that every day in my work helping people whose lives are shattered by conflict and disaster, when governments are in retreat from big problems, businesses and civil society needs to step up, and I think that's what needs to happen now.
Well, I was just going to say, do you think that is happening now? Do you think the business community is seizing the mantle, as it were, to help drive that innovation and drive the needs to tackle these big issues? Do you think the business community really is stepping up where governments have failed?
Not enough. I mean, there's a simple answer: not enough. None of us are doing enough yet. I mean, really, I think we've got to take our responsibilities seriously in this respect. And clearly there are some businesses that are doing a lot, but net, nowhere near enough. They're not doing enough, they're not shouting enough, they're not explaining enough, they're not mobilizing enough. And if you look at any of the metrics, we're not on track. And that's a global business responsibility as well as a local one. And remember, there's a great danger that we simply export our carbon emissions and allow them to be done somewhere else. And really thinking across the energy mix, which is the heart of this challenge, requires us, I think, all to just keep on, just crack down on the happy talk. Any of the happy talk is going to land us in. By the way, the phrase happy talk, just so people know, it comes from what American commanders were told in Vietnam, from Vietnam. And the Vietnam War went wrong for many reasons, but one reason was the commanders on the ground were told, we want good news. And that's where the phrase happy talk comes from. And happy talk lands businesses and governments in a terrible mess. And it's not about doomsdayism, but it is about realism.
Well, I was going to say, is that where we are? Because certainly the reality that most of us are living right now, confined to homes and offices, unable to move and still clinging to a semblance of normality and hoping that that will someday return. It's easy to be overwhelmed by the constant waves of bad news and the doomsday prediction coming from scientists when it comes to tackling the pandemic, tackling climate change and moving forward. Is there not a need for some optimism there as well? Because when you have a challenge that you're facing that's like a cliff in front of you, a seemingly insurmountable task, how do you lift people up to begin to tackle that and not feel overwhelmed by the reality that's staring us all in the face?
Well, I actually take the opposite lesson at the moment. I'm struck by resilience, courage, innovation, determination. I mean, the world has never had more resources than it has today to tackle big problems. And I think that's inspiring. But so is the courage and resilience and innovation of people on the ground. Look, people often say to me, how is it to lead an international humanitarian organization when there are more refugees than ever before, more ethnic cleansing than ever before, more civil conflict than ever before? I say, well, if you look at the statistics, you get depressed. If you look at the people, you have hope. And there's no room for us to be depressed while people who are actually on the front line are sustaining their own human dignity and commitment in the face of absolutely insuperable odds. I mean, what am I dealing with today? I'm dealing with Afghanistan. I'm dealing with Ethiopia. I'm dealing with Yemen. Those people are showing courage and resilience on those civilians in those cases on an extraordinary level. So from my point of view, it's not optimism, pessimism, because human beings are inbuilt to survive and recover. What we have to do, what the spectrum I see is between inertia and mobilization. And we have to take on the inertia and go with the mobilization. Every business, every organization, every government, global metrics, local metrics. And from my point of view, this simple point that we've never had more resources to make a difference than ever before it's not the life raft to cling on to, it's the idea and the ideal to mobilize around. And so rather than debating whether or not there's going to be a catastrophe in 2100, let's get on with making sure that we do everything in our ability to make sure there isn't.
Do you think people feel empowered to be able to tackle these big crises? Because certainly hearing you say that we've never had more resources to turn this around, I mean, it does give you a shift in mindset. It's given me a shift in mindset, certainly. Do you think part of the thing that's been holding a lot of us back is we don't feel empowered to make these huge changes or to tackle these things?
Well, I think that's a great point. And of course, one's got to be honest, as individuals, our own ability to make to use your phrase, quote unquote, huge difference, we're not going to make a huge difference as individuals in our own lives. Those with leadership positions can do more in their own businesses, but we shouldn't kid ourselves about this. Look, I think the way to answer your questions is as follows. Just give me 45 seconds or a minute on this, because I think there's a really important point, and it kind of links the last two questions. The Pope went to Lampedusa off Italy in 2014, which was where many of the refugees were coming from Syria via Turkey, ending up in the Mediterranean. They reached European land at Lampedusa. And he went there and he saw tremendous neglect. And he pointed the finger at all of us and he said, what we're seeing is the globalization of indifference, which is an extraordinary phrase. I mean, he was basically saying it's the globalization of selfishness. Now, here's the interesting thing. I mean, I don't know. I mean, one's always got to be. I don't want to argue with the Pope, but I actually don't think people are indifferent. Actually, we're more conscious than ever before of what's going on other sides of the world. I don't think our humanity has been drained, but where we've got a real issue is precisely what you're talking about, which is empowerment and agency. People don't, I think, care less, but they don't know what they can do more. And that's, I think, where the alignment, sorry to go back to this, between the government leadership, the business innovation, and the mass mobilization comes together. We've got to know that others are doing their bit, because then we're all part of a team. And in that sense, you know, that what's become a cliche, there's no planet, you know, there's no planet B, is true. The human race has got to work together on this. Now, those most exposed, it's the poorest who are most exposed to the danger here. I mean, 8-10 times greater danger to the poor rather than the rich, and obviously both in terms of their exposure and their ability to do something about it through adaptation. And so there's a moral issue here as well as an economic issue, but I think they both point in the same direction. There's the right moral thing to do, which is to take on this challenge, but frankly, people are going to make money out of it as well. And it's not a choice between action that is expensive and inaction which is cheap. It's that action will cost, but inaction will cost more.
Okay. If we look at the transformational change that can begin to happen, certainly at a lower level, there's little we can all do to change the global governments. We go to the ballot boxes where we're able to and hopefully affect that change there. But in terms of the smaller actions that we can do to try and encourage and foster this environment of a change of mindset and pushing it up the ladder and bringing the leadership from below, what would you recommend the first steps that people try and do in order to start affecting that change and filling the gaps?
If you don't mind, I just want to answer the first part of the question, though, because I don't think we should dismiss it. I mean, this point about, you're obviously right, we can't affect global governance directly. But I want to say this to this business audience, because I think it's really important. The voice of business in calling for more effective global political leadership is really important. There's a whole trope in politics around the Western world at the moment. Globalization's bad, the globalism is bad, it's all terrible, we should have a more nationalistic approach to these things. I think that's profoundly out of step with the realities of the modern world. Climate, health security, literal security, economic security. And I sat on something called the Independent Panel on Pandemic Preparedness and Response. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it was essentially how to prevent the next COVID and how to deal with this one. And just to your point about global governance, the World Health Organization is underpowered and underfunded. And business, and we're speaking to a business audience today, they should be speaking up, in my view, as well as politicians and ex-politicians, that we need stronger global political management of an interconnected world. So we can't vote for a stronger WHO, but you can make a hell of a lot of noise against the argument that the world's problem today is that global institutions are too strong. Obviously, this takes us into the whole Brexit thing, and I'm not trying to rerun that argument. But there's a whole argument being run by people with a particular point of view that regional institutions like the EU, global institutions like the WHO, remember President Trump pulled out of the WHO, that they're too strong. Wrong. Global political institutions are too weak for the modern world, not too strong for the modern world. They're not threatening our freedom because the WHO is issuing mandates that are too strong. Our freedom is threatened because the WHO is too weak. It can't go in and do investigations in countries. It doesn't have the power to go and do that. And so this argument about what's wrong with the modern world, is it that global institutions are too strong or that they're too weak, is a really important argument that we should all be part of. And one voice obviously doesn't answer it, but let's not just park that. Now, on to the second part of your, or actually what was the main question. Look, my thinking about this is that the best way to answer it is not to start talking about whether or not you should rinse your plates before you put them in the dishwasher. For an audience like this one, the key thing is what we all know. What you measure is what you manage. And my plea to the practical boardroom change that you're asking for is to focus on decarbonisation. How much are you reducing your carbon emissions? Not just how much are you compensating for them, but getting the right definition of net zero. Because it's not just keep on pumping carbon emissions in the atmosphere, but buy a load of trees, plant a load of trees. It's got to be really take seriously the need to decarbonise and measure the decarbonisation. Measure your building. We've had a refurb in our New York office. It's going to be very high rated for its environmental efficiency. It's much harder in the middle of South Sudan or in the middle of Yemen where we're working. But nonetheless, try to make sure that the metrics by which you're judging success are the right metrics. And they need to be decarbonisation metrics. And I think that's a really practical way that businesses can hold themselves, that we can all hold ourselves to the right account.
But how would you answer the charge that many people say we can't afford to do those, to work towards things like decarbonisation, or whenever the notion of a carbon tax is introduced, many say, well, we simply can't afford that. It would drive companies out of business. How would you respond to that charge?
Well, you can answer it at a macro level and then at a micro level. The macro level is the costs of not acting are greater than the costs of acting. I mean, I don't know how many times we have to, I'm not complaining about you because you're right to raise the question, but it's more expensive not to tackle this problem than it is to tackle it. Just ask anyone whose home is flooded, ask any insurance company that's bumping up insurance premiums because of payouts. We're all going to suffer for that. Just like the cost of preparing for COVID would have been minuscule compared to the cost of actually dealing with it. I mean, the cost of dealing with COVID, I think there was a G20 had a report, I can't remember, 75 times the cost of planning and preparing for COVID than actually dealing with it. So at the macro level, we've got to make that argument. At the micro level, look, you've got to fight out the things. Some proposals for a carbon tax include the proposal that the revenues from a carbon tax are given back to individuals in that tax jurisdiction. So you've got to fight out those individual arguments. Yes, the people say, well, you know, renewable energy. Well, 10 years ago, solar was more expensive. Today, it's cheaper, actually, than high carbon sources, even without a carbon tax being imposed. So I think it's got to be argued through at a macro level and at a micro level and at a realistic level as well. And the costs of renewable energy, to take that as an example, are massively coming down. But what matters then, if you're going to make the argument about renewable energy, you've got to show how it then follows through into the transport system, for example, across all aspects of society. So I think this is a whole of society approach that's needed.
Okay, so if we just take the section of society that we're speaking to right now, those who are sitting around the boardroom tables, what's one practical thing they could be doing, one takeaway they could do to help make that difference that will impact and affect generations to come in a positive way?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that performative, symbolic moves are not enough. There's two things are in my mind. One is this point about what you measure. Really choose the right metrics. I mean, that's a big board responsibility. If you're on the board of a public company or even a private company, that's the That's absolutely key. Don't kid yourselves and don't kid others, and make sure you've got a decarbonisation metric. The second, though, is to try to draw a couple of the strands of our conversation together. I mean, COVID has exposed how we can prosper without the amount of business travel there was before. The idea of having a meeting on Zoom is now much more, or on any other platform, it is much more present than before. And I think that the Build Back Better slogan has been used a lot in government. I haven't seen it very much in business. And I think that it's not sloganeering that matters, but it means really thinking about the footprint. I mean, we're thinking much harder in my organization. I mean, we work in 40 countries, 200 field sites, much more local hiring, much less reliance on long distance travel. I mean, it's more cost effective as well as more cost efficient. And so I think there's a real COVID plus climate opportunity here to turn Build Back Better from a slogan, which it is too often in politics, to a reality which it could be in business.
And just finally, because I can hear my cat meowing in the background, so he's obviously he's run out of time. But just given everything that we've discussed and the challenges that face all of us ahead, are you optimistic for the future?
Look, I'm an optimistic person, and so that's easy question. The world's going to do amazing things in the rest of my lifetime and way beyond. But it's also got the capacity to do terrible things. And terrible things to other people and terrible things to the planet that then rebound on us. So it's easy to answer in a way, but I think that there's really important job to confront forces of real danger and forces that pull the world apart, forces that turn people into strangers, forces that turn difference and diversity into something that's threatening, something that takes common humanity, which is what my organization deals with every day, that tries to strip people who are fleeing from war of their humanity. And I think my big thing is that my family were very lucky. My parents were refugees in the 1940s. They were saved literally by strangers. And we have a duty to strangers because we're all on this planet together. And I think that is about asserting our humanity, and that seems to me to be the primary responsibility today.
Okay, David Miliband, it was great speaking with you and thrashing through these big issues. I've certainly learned a lot, if anything, to perhaps be more optimistic and harness the power that lies within all of us to make these changes and not just assume that we're powerless to change what lies ahead. Certainly there are big challenges, but if the world's leaders do feel empowered to act in a way that will help everybody and help all of us succeed, certainly where there is a will, there will be a way to rely on that phrase. And it's also quite heartening to hear you say that we've never had more tools at our disposal to help tackle these challenges. So that's certainly a positive takeaway that I leave this discussion with. A number of themes have emerged. Certainly we'll leave it to all the delegates to pursue these themes and these conversations in the days ahead. But it is really healthy to keep talking. It's really healthy to keep that innovation going and to maintain that desire to change, because certainly we can't just stay where we are. David, thank you. It was a fascinating conversation, and we really appreciate you sharing your ideas and your experience with us.